Hi, it's me, Ingrid INFP, and I'm going to be talking about Proust again. And I've done a video like 2 years ago about reading Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu's first book, Du côté de chez les Swann, which is called Swan's Way in English. I just finished listening to the French audiobook of I don't know what it is in English, but it's À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleur, which is in the shade of the young woman in bloom or in flower. And I really like Proust's way of doing things. And for context, like this is an INFP MBTI channel, but I do talk about books, but I think Proust is an INFP, and that's why I relate to the way that he sees the world. And he rambles a lot, and that's what I do in my videos pretty much. And he sees the small details, and a lot of his focus is on memories, it's on impressions, it's on the phenomenology of the experience of life rather than the actual experience of life. Not much plot happens, it's more vibes, you know? And he wrote 7 books. It's his autobiography, but it's also not. It is a narrator that is very much like him, but not exactly him. And I would say that I prefer Swan's Way due to it being more about childhood and childhood impressions. This book is about his adolescence. I don't know how you say it, adolescence, where he meets these young women in flower, basically a bunch of young girls. And what happens is that in real life, Proust was very sickly throughout his life, and he had bad asthma and congestion, and he got all sorts of like weird treatments from the doctors at the time. Also, apparently Proust's father was a doctor. But yeah, it wasn't curable. You couldn't get better from asthma as we do today, you know? Nowadays we have inhalators. At that time they had like trips to the sea. And in the book it's kind of funny because the doctor prescribes him to drink alcohol because it will soothe his nerves kind of and make him happy. Which, well, was not great. But that's the reason that he goes to the sea. And that's when he meets all of these girls on the beach. And it's interesting how he just, everything is about how his memories are. And memories are fragmented. They're shadows, they're reflections. There are gaps in them. And he sees all these girls as like just uniform mass, and seeing all of these like there are just a group of girls, and they all have all of his desires are projected onto like basically all of them at the same time, or at one at a time. And he compares it to a painting, and a lot of the book is about art. He meets artists of different kinds. He meets Vinteuil, who is a musician, a composer. He meets Bergotte, which is his basically his favorite author from childhood. These are fake people, and Elstir is an impressionist painter. And it's interesting how they all have their different take on art. And Marcel Proust, basically our narrator, is learning from them. And he pieces together what is most important to him, which is the recollections, the reminiscence, going back to his past, and what sticks and what doesn't, and what sticks and what doesn't in art too. So, also he goes to the theater at the beginning, and it kind of destabilizes him because it wasn't like what he thought it would be. And I'll go through a little bit chronologically through the book, but like memory isn't chronological, right? So what I'm doing is not that great. It's not the way that Proust would have liked it to be, but okay. And he talks about how dreams are sometimes more important than reality, and they sometimes feel more real than reality, and how time is elastic and not real, and how sometimes it stretches and sometimes it's goes too quickly. He talks about how the way that you perceive yourself is not the same way as other people perceive you, and the way that you perceive others is not the way that they perceive themselves. And that also affects art, because it's like the way that you see a piece of art will be different from how another person sees a piece of art. We all have different experiences. He finally gets into the good graces of these people that he has admired his whole childhood, basically. And he rises up in society to meet this girl that he's been in love with. Now, for context, Proust was most probably gay. Maybe he was bi, but he was found like in a male brothel, as a paying patron, basically. And so also he talks a lot about homosexuality in his books, but he doesn't talk about it much in the first two books that I read, but there have been parts here and there where there have been like gender non-conforming person that was depicted in one of that artist's paintings. And then also there was this one lesbian couple in the first book, but apparently he amps it up really much in the next books. So I don't know if I'm going to read more Proust books, because it's a lot, they're very long, and it's kind of boring, but in a pleasant way. So it's like nice audiobooks to fall asleep to, pretty much. But I find that the lulling, hypnotizing aspect is part of the experience of reading Proust. Like, it's not a book to be on high alert all the time for, He has really long run-on sentences. It's a mess, but it's a beautiful mess. It's pure masterpiece art, and I understand why these are classics. I don't know why, though, that I went to French schools when I grew up. I grew up in France, and we never did any Proust, and I think that it's because he's not very quotable. Like, his sentences are so long, and it's kind of like you have to be immersed, like you have to be in the story. It has to take all of those hundreds of pages before you start understanding, grasping the philosophy behind it, which is that time just flows in the way that all these words come out, and it can't be captured through a quote. That's why I did that 1 hour video in French, just reading out quotes. And I think that in retrospect, it's kind of like a meta piece of art that I did, where I made a video for myself. Nobody else cared about it, because who wants to watch an hour-long video of me reading Proust quotes? Nobody, not even myself, but doing it is kind of the way that Proust would have wanted it, in a way. So he talks about seeing different scenes in his head and how he compares it to architecture quite a bit. And he'll talk about somebody's facial expression and compare it to the landscape or compare it to a building. And it's made explicit at the end of this book where the painter, the Impressionist painter, paints the sea and the sky, and you can't distinguish between the sea and the sky, and you need to label these things in order to see where the line goes between the sea and the sky. You have to, in order to make sense of the world, you have to put delineations and stuff. And that's how we make sense of our memories. We fill in the gaps with our imagination. We rectify things as we get to learn things about the world. And that's how our memories of people gets different and changed and warped through time because we have added onto it from our imagination. So he talks about the perspective of a facial expression, like the lines of perspective. He talks about seeing a person from different projections, different angles, changes the way that we see a person entirely. And it's like you have several different versions of a person that you love, depending on which angle you saw them last. He also, much like in memory, he can't remember where the mole, there's this girl he apparently loves, but he can't remember if her mole was on her chin or by her eye or on her lip, and it just keeps changing. He talks about how time started becoming real for him during adolescence, where he started realizing that he was subjected to the laws of time, and suddenly he there was New Year's where he said that he now was an old person and that he wasn't oblivious to time in the way that he was as a child. It's like he compares it to that we know that the earth is turning, but we do not perceive it. He talks a lot about so how the images are shaky in his mind, and he tries to figure out, there are certain things that he prioritizes and certain things that he does not. I'm not that interested in his romances because who knows how much of it is real, because I think that he doesn't write women very well. That's the one problem with Proust, and I think that's because he was probably gay. His women are very two-dimensional, and sure, that was a thing that men at the time did not write women very well. But the fact that he understands so much about human psychology and then it's like nothing, he knows about how people's personality traits solidify through time and how they're changeable as a teenager. So he talks a little bit about that. And then he talks about how the environment affects people the way that chemical reactions affect cells. It's interesting to know about the technologies of the time because he talks about the telephone and how electricity in the home and airplanes. And the thing is, he is talking about his past. So certain things that were invented then started becoming commonplace when he was writing the book. There is this whole thing of Proust Proust was pretty, well off in society, He was Jewish though, so that led to certain difficulties. I guess, I'm guessing, I don't know. But I think that was a pretty okay time. Um, and he was like in the right position in society in order to not need to suffer that much. What he suffered of was his health, and his melancholic airs, as you know, a real poet should have at that point. I don't know when Proust was a big thing. I don't know if he was a contemporary of Freud, because he really seems to be really into those kinds of ideas. I don't know if he was like the fin siècle kind of authors. I know that he came after Victor Hugo. He does talk about certain famous writers or at the time. He mixes reality and fiction in this way. But I think that he came after Victor Hugo, so I think that he was part of that like romantic writers. But he was also one of the realist writers. So I don't really know where he fits in all that. But he does something that I do not find in other writers. But I find it in paintings, you know? You find it in the Impressionist art, and you find it in certain pieces of music, the romantic Ravel, like the pieces of music of the time. And I find it beautiful that he was able to transmit that poetry into prose in a way. The metaphors are beautiful. The way that he sees things, it reminds me of Clara and the Sun, actually, where Clara is a robot. Okay, this is much later, but she sees the world in like little parts, little pixels, and that's kind of how Impressionist art is made. So it's very clever, and I don't know if anybody else writes like Proust. Tell me if you guys know of any writers that are like Proust. I just find it really interesting. And I find Proust has this sensitivity to the small things that I really relate to. You know, he eats a madeleine and then he's transported, just like I am. You know, I eat the madeleine and I'm like, oh, you know, I suddenly, all of these memories of me start popping up. And surely it's just a human experience, but I think that that's the kind of thing that INFPs live for. Anyway, he talks about how everything changes. The only thing that doesn't change is that everything changes, which, you know. He also talks about how there's certain words that are put in light. He talks a lot about the position of the light, which is why I'm filming with the light. You know, it's like a theater piece. He even talks about photography and how the light is very important, the angle of the light, the perspective. And so the painter Elstir, in the novel, he paints these maritime scenes, and he talks about how so Proust came to this seaside town with like thinking that he was going to go into like these like the stormy seas, and it's going to be a lot of consistence to the water, that it was going to be dark and that it was going to be thick. And he comes to Balbec, which is the seaside town, and he notices that the water is clear and translucent and light, like the froth that comes up from the waves, you know. It's glittering, and the heat and the freshness of the water is contrasted. and he's really into that, and he's able to finally relax, because that's the whole point of a strip, right, is so that he can relax. And he lives a life of ease, so he doesn't need to work. He's supposed to be writing his novel or whatever, but he doesn't do that. He just like basically hangs around with all these girls, and just lies down on the grass. But that's fine, because he is actually enjoying the life. He talks about also how genius is about how you transform things, like an electric lamp will transform the energy into light. And it's not about the power of the lamp, it's about the fact that the lamp can transform this energy into something else. So it's about the reflection, the transformation, rather than in the intrinsic qualities. It's about the way that it is reflected in others. So I found that to be really interesting, really insightful. I've written some quotes here, but I'm going to skip a bit. So my favorite part was when he talks about the automobile and the train, and he contrasts these two modes of transport. Back then, the automobile was much more, rough, and so you would feel the bumps on the road, and you would see every single, it was a whole adventure to take the automobile. But he prefers the train, because the train is this magic of like how he can be in one train station and then wake up in another, like a flying carpet or something has transported him to this whole new place. And that's what he wants in life, is that sense of magic. And even though you would have a more realistic, more true to life experience by taking the car, and you would see every single bump in the road and you would experience the whole thing, maybe sometimes it's better to not experience the reality of the trip in order to be transported spiritually, magically by it, So that was also an interesting thought. Very SE blind of of him to think in that way. I relate. And he talks a little bit about how other people see him, and he says that he's not good at observing things. He's much more interested in like his imagination than the actual reality. He talks about how light can destroy everything. It can change everything and reconstruct it, and just like the artists do. So he talks about how it's kind of like a laboratory of creation, because painting is transformation. And let's see, the cliffs become like cathedrals in their architecture and how they structure the space for this painter, but also how it structures space for him in his mind. And he is now searching for this light kind of water, this airy kind of water, which he hadn't been looking for beforehand. He also talks about how foods very often remind him of his childhood. So he was eating, and certain foods speak to him. Like he feels like they literally speak to him, and some of them don't. Because those that speak to him are like the fruit tarts really speak to him because they remind him of the fruits from his childhood. They also remind him of the girls that he loves, because they would prepare these cakes, or their servants would. Um, he talks about how artists are always going into themselves, except when they are, like, they have to do this, except when they are exempt from their friends to get out of themselves. Um, and the reason that the artist has to do this, according to him, is that people are like living beings, like trees, and not like buildings. So buildings are constructed from the outside, while the trees have the are constructing themselves from the inside. Um, and how we model ourselves according to others, but really everything comes from the inside, and we need to go into those depths. And once again, he goes into how remembering, he says that remembering another person is actually to forget them and to reconstruct them from our earlier views of them, but to rectify it afterwards into the person that they are now. And these people that we've created get destroyed every time that we don't see them for a while. So that's sad, but that's how it is. And he talks about how we interpret certain things, and we create these people in much the same way that the electricity becomes speech in the telephone. So it's interesting how he mixes art, memory, and technology into one big thing. And he talks a lot about like what is left for posterity, and he says that the emotion can give you the sense that the whole world is inside you, when really the world will continue going on without you. And at the very end, he talks, the last sentences are basically that the light of day seems like death because it is permanent fixture, but it is actually embalmed. It's embalming in a coat of gold. And so even though throughout the book he'd been talking about how the light was changeable, the way that time can stand still in a certain moment can seem like it is embalmed in gold, and that becomes your memory. And so there I've gone through the book. There's many pages, many things I could have decided to focus on, but I'm not that interested in the romance part. What I was interested in is the memories part. I find that Proust is a wonderful artist, and I wish I could read more of his books. However, I have heard that more, like the next book, for example, Du Côté des Guermantes, is much more about Parisian society, and I'm not really interested in that coming from him. What I'm more interested in is his descriptions of nature and of memory. Apparently, when you read the whole thing, you start realizing that everything is linked together. And that's something that I really love to see and hear. I love when you've been reading the story and then like all these threads of philosophies are going together. And that's why I think at the end, the last book is called Le Temps Retrouvé, the found time, basically, and refound time. So the time hasn't been lost, it's been refound. But I really relate to the way that Proust sees the world, and I think that this is what I love thinking about, is the way that we perceive things and interpret things. So tell me what you guys think. Have you read Proust? Do you want to read Proust? I know that it's not for everyone, but I think it's worth trying it out once in a while. Like once in your life, trying to read it. Now, will I read more? I don't know, but yeah. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.